Hello to you. I do hope you're well. Welcome to this GCSE Religious Studies video. I'm Ben Waddle, and today we are continuing our look at AQA Theme B with a look at the contrasting views on euthanasia. So let's start with a quick overview of the Theme B specification, which sets out everything we need to know for the Theme B section of the exam. And today we are focusing, as I've mentioned, on euthanasia, and we'll take a look at the Christian and Islamic views on euthanasia and cover everything you need to know for a grade 9. So let's get started with our keywords. The first keyword today is death, which is the end of the physical bodily life. And of course, that is relevant today because we are talking about euthanasia, which is the assisting with the ending of life for a person who is usually terminally ill or has a degenerative illness. And we will look at both of those case studies today. It is often known as assisted suicide. It is sometimes known as a mercy killing. And then the third key term today is sanctity of life. Now, this is a concept we are quite familiar with now, but it's really important when we're talking about euthanasia. It is, of course, the belief that life is sacred and holy because it was created by God. And so many religious people believe that euthanasia is wrong because only God can take away life, that life is sacred, it therefore has intrinsic worth and value, and so it should never be ended, it should never be taken away. Now, in terms of euthanasia, there are two different types that we need to know. The first one is active euthanasia, and this is deliberately acting to end a life, for example, with lethal drugs. And this is illegal in the UK. We will look in a moment at the countries where this is legal for certain reasons, but in the UK, it is illegal. And it is, as I say, deliberately acting. So that's a great way to remember it, active and acting. It's acting to end a life with, for example, lethal drugs. The other key concept then is passive euthanasia. And this is when medical professionals make the decision to withdraw a treatment that is necessary for maintaining life. So, for example, switching off a life support machine. So, of course, both of these raise really interesting ethical and moral questions. Our focus today, though, will be on active euthanasia. We will be asking, should this be legal in the UK? What do Christians believe? What do Muslims believe? And as I just mentioned, in today's video, we will be referring repeatedly to the sanctity of life principle. And so it's important we're clear. This is a religious concept that all human life is sacred because it has been created by God. And so in its strongest form, which is held, for example, by the Catholic Church, it is always wrong to take away human life. And they believe that that applies from conception, because as we know from the previous video on abortion, Catholics believe that life begins at conception, so they are against abortion, and Catholics are also against euthanasia, because they believe that all human life is intrinsically valuable, it is sacred because it has been created by God, so it should never be taken away under any circumstances. However, we will also be considering situation ethics and the idea that it is sometimes loving to take into account the quality of someone's life as well. And so there could be certain situations when it is the most loving thing to do to actually allow someone euthanasia. Now, euthanasia actually means, the word itself means a good death. And so we'll be talking about the idea of how could euthanasia be seen as a good death, for example, for someone with a terminal illness, with a degenerative illness. So plenty to talk about today. We will be looking at the contrasting views. And at the end of the video, I hope you'll be in a position to write a 12 out of 12 question 5 answer and secure a grade 9 if it does come up on the exam. So let's start by asking, why might somebody wish for active euthanasia? In terms of where they can actually have active euthanasia, this is legal in certain circumstances in Australia, Colombia, New Zealand, Belgium, Luxembourg, Spain, Canada, and the Netherlands. So what reasons might somebody give? And do you think any of these are justifiable? So we could say loss of control and independence, so someone can no longer do the things that they were once able to do for themselves. It could be a fear of future suffering after receiving a diagnosis, for example. They might have a degenerative illness, which is only going to worsen with no chance of recovery, and so they would like a painless death on their own terms before that illness can progress further. It might be because they face worsening pain or suffering as a result of an illness. They might have a terminal illness, so they know that there is no recovery. And again, they'd like to die peacefully on their own terms in an environment of their choice. Again, it could be a worsening condition with no hope of recovery. They might express a desire to die with dignity. They might say they're unable to cope with the pain any longer, or they might be unable to do things they used to do. So, of course, very similar to that idea of a loss of control and independence. And again, what do you think? Do you think any of these are justifiable reasons for euthanasia, or do you think that euthanasia is always wrong? And of course, make sure you're thinking why. You know, we don't just want to say, yes, I do think that's okay, or no, I'm completely against it. You've always got to have that explanation. And hopefully today's video will help us develop our explanations with evidence from both the Bible and the Quran. So I want to introduce you to this man here, Tony Nicholson. Now, as you can see, he looks there a very happy, healthy man, doesn't he? Having a brilliant evening, it looks like, with his wife there. They're obviously at an event somewhere, so they might have been doing some dancing, going around the room, seeing friends, catching up with family maybe, living their best lives, we could say. They certainly look like they are a happy couple, that he is living a happy, healthy life. We know that he was a very active man and he enjoyed taking part in sports, a very busy man who took real pride in being able to provide for his family, to go out and live a very active life. And as I say, to live his best life. And it looks like he is doing so in that image there. Really looks very happy, looks very healthy, and, you know, looks really proud, confident. Obviously, I feel like I'm doing a bit of an English lesson here, analysing something with as many adjectives as I can, but hopefully you get the gist of what I'm saying. And I want you to keep this image in mind when we look now at the next image, because this is how Tony ultimately was. This is what happened as a result of a stroke that he had, which left him completely paralyzed, unable to walk, unable to talk, unable to feed himself, unable to dress himself, unable to do anything at all. And again, there is his lovely wife once again, but it's such a contrast, isn't it? And he said, this is his quote, "My life has become a living nightmare." So I'll show you that first image again. There they are having a great time, looking happy and healthy. And then that second image of Tony after the stroke, and then obviously left paralyzed there, unable to walk, talk, feed himself, do absolutely anything for himself. And he also wasn't able to take his own life. He was so severely paralyzed that although he said, "My life has become a living nightmare and I want to end it," he physically was unable to do that because of the condition that he was in. And his case is a really high profile case. And so we need to talk about it today, and you can absolutely refer to him in the exam. So Tony Nicholson was, as we saw, a healthy, happy and very active man. In 2005, as I said, he had a stroke that left him paralyzed. He could only move his head and his eyes, and that meant he could no longer walk, talk, feed himself, or do anything for himself without assistance. And he described his life as a living nightmare. I think one of the most powerful images there is that even when he was upset about his condition, his wife then had to dry his tears for him. He couldn't even dry his own tears. So obviously he could not do anything at all for himself, whether that was feeding himself, going to the toilet, any of those basic tasks that we all just do, we take for granted, you could say, on a daily basis. He was no longer able to do. And he said, "My life has become a living nightmare. I am completely trapped and I can't stand this." He could not stand the situation he was in. And so, perhaps unsurprisingly, I think we could say, for many years, he had wanted to end his life. But as I mentioned, he was so paralyzed that he could not do so without help. So he was desperately, you know, upset, angry, frustrated, in pain. You know, he could not. And as I say, you know, I think we can I can't say the word now. We can empathize with him. You know, he could not put up with this any longer. He said his life was a living nightmare, but it was such a living nightmare that he could not even end his life when he wanted to, because, as they say, he could only move his head and his eyes. So again, he couldn't talk, so he's in a position here where he's wanting to end his life, but he's so paralyzed that he could not do so without help. So he asked the High Court to state that it would be lawful for a doctor to help him in his position to end his life. However, based on UK laws against assisted suicide and euthanasia, the courts refused. So his case was taken to the High Court, it was considered, but they said because of the UK laws we have against assisted suicide, even in your position, even though this is your request that you're making, that is not going to be allowed. We are refusing this request. Now, as a result of that, Tony Nicholson refused food and water, and he then died of pneumonia, which of course would have been, I think, very painful for his family to see, and probably painful for him to go through as well, that's how he spent his final days, when he had requested euthanasia. Now, this is a really how can we put it? This is a really emotional situation, isn't it? And it's a really unique situation. And we have got to ask, and this is the question we've got to ask, should Tony Nicholson have been granted the right to die? So should he have been assisted by a doctor to end his life, because that's what he wanted, by the UK courts? Or were they right to say that because of the laws that we have, you cannot have assisted suicide? This is not going to be allowed. So that's to get us thinking. This is the case of Tony Nicholson, as I say, who was paralysed as a result of a stroke. And he was so paralysed that although he desperately wanted to end his life, which he saw as a living nightmare, he was not able to do so. And then the court said that he could not be assisted to do so. Now, there will be a lot of opinions about this on both sides of the argument, of course. We want to have this case study ready to use in the exam. We want to show the examiner we understand and we know real life case studies that are out there, and people, who are grappling with the laws and the morality of euthanasia. And so we're going to consider Tony in the context of all of today's discussions. So the first point of view I want to give you is from someone called John Stuart Mill. Now, he was a famous philosopher, and he wrote a book called On Liberty. And in this book, he wrote, over one's mind and over one's body, the individual is sovereign. And the word sovereign means that you have power and control. So it's the idea that over your own life, you should have autonomy. You should have complete choice, and it should be your choice. So if he wanted to end his life and he was judged to have been of a sound mind, then he should have been allowed to do that, or somebody should have assisted him doing that. Now, of course, a big question we can ask is, but could they then be prosecuted, for example, for murder? How can we be sure that that is what he actually wanted? Could the person who assisted him then actually be prosecuted for murder? But in terms of this key quote from John Stuart Mill, who was a key 19th century philosopher, he said that we should have autonomy over our lives, that people should have freedom, they should have liberty over their own lives. So over one's own mind and over one's body, the individual is sovereign. So that could certainly, couldn't it, support an argument for having the right to die. However, someone who would strongly disagree is the Pope here. Now, this is a former Pope, but the current Pope would support this as well, because the Catholic Church is very clear in its opposition to euthanasia. And the former Pope, Pope John Paul II, said that euthanasia is a grave violation against the law of God. And so the Catholic Church is completely against euthanasia. So even in the case of Tony Nicholson, they would be completely against it. They would say it does not matter the circumstance. All life is sacred. It is always wrong to take away life. The 10 Commandments say do not kill. They don't say do not kill unless. There are no exceptions. There are no special exemptions. Everyone has to follow the same rule, which is do not kill. All life is sacred. You cannot allow euthanasia within society. So We're going to have a look now at the contrasting beliefs about euthanasia within both Christianity and Islam. If you have downloaded the PowerPoint, you might like to print this table off, and then you can actually fill in the explanations as we talk through them in the video. So let's have a look at these contrasting beliefs, shall we? And remember, in the exam, especially question 4 and 5, always make sure you are referring to scripture. You don't need to get the reference exactly correct. As long as you're just saying in the Bible it teaches, in the Quran it teaches, it will be enough to get your marks for reference to scripture. So let's have a look. The first one, of course, do not kill, is a classic quote for us. And this teaches Christians that euthanasia is always wrong because it goes against one of God's 10 commandments, which of course were revealed to Moses. And this one is do not kill. Euthanasia therefore goes against God's laws. And as I say, there are no exceptions, there are no exemptions to that. The commandment is very clear, do not kill. Our next one is from the Quran. Nobody may die except by permission of God at an appointed time. This teaches Muslims that euthanasia is always wrong because it is an attempt to play God. Only God can give or take away life. He is sovereign over all human life. And so we should never take away human life. Another key quote from the Quran is do not kill yourself or others. This teaches Muslims that euthanasia is always wrong because you should never take away human life. Suicide and assisted suicide are prohibited by the Quran, which of course is seen as the infallible and inerrant word of God. And so for a Muslim, euthanasia is always wrong because it involves taking human life, which is seen as sinful. Pope John Paul II, as we just mentioned, says that euthanasia is a grave violation against the law of God. This teaches Christians that euthanasia is always wrong because it goes against the law of God. It involves ending a human life, which is a sin. You should trust in God's plan and respect his sovereignty over life. Our next quote, though, would be used as a contrasting view. It's from St. Paul. He said, clothe yourselves with compassion. Now, of course, he wasn't talking here about euthanasia, but he is talking here about the importance of compassion. And so some Christians might apply this or might understand this in this context to mean that euthanasia could sometimes be morally justifiable if it is for a compassionate reason. So, for example, if it is to alleviate pain and allow someone to die with dignity if they have a terminal or degenerative illness. So if somebody is in immense increasing suffering from a terminal illness or degenerative illness, someone like Tony Nicholson in that very, very difficult position where they believe their life is now a living nightmare and there is no cure for it, surely it's the most compassionate thing, you might argue, to allow them euthanasia if that is what they want. And another quote for you from St. Paul is, above all, be loving. So, of course, this teaches Christians that being loving is the most important thing. This quote, of course, helps lay the foundation for situation ethics, which is based on doing the most loving thing in every situation. Another quote, of course, that we've mentioned, John Stuart Mill, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. So you could say this teaches humanists that we should have autonomy over our own body and mind. Human beings should have the freedom and the right to do what they wish. That could, of course, include assisted suicide. But then finally, another really interesting quote from a philosopher, from Peter Saunders, is the right to die can so easily become a duty to die. Now, this is interesting because this is the idea that if you just give people the right to die in certain cases, for example, Tony Nicholson, that could actually have a negative effect on the rest of society. It could actually lead to a very negative impact on other people because, as I've put here, this warns people that even if euthanasia was allowed in extreme circumstances, this could be a slippery slope that creates a society where elderly or terminally ill people feel a burden and they feel they actually have a duty to have euthanasia. So whilst you might think it's a loving and compassionate thing to allow it in certain circumstances, Peter Saunders is warning that could become a slippery slope to a culture in society where people who get to a certain age or have a certain condition feel a duty to die because they feel they're a burden and they feel that that's what they need to do in order to make sure they're not being a burden. So interesting to think about, you know, the longer term implications and the wider implications of even allowing euthanasia in certain circumstances. So that's a great rebuttal to the argument that it could be a loving thing in certain circumstances, because you could say, but actually it's not loving because of the bigger impact or the wider impact of that on the rest of society, that then the elderly, the terminally ill, for example, feel they then have a duty to die. So, you know, that's obviously an A-level standard of argument that we're making there, but it is really interesting to consider when we think about the morality of euthanasia. So, what do Christians believe about euthanasia? On the screen here are a selection of key quotes that Christians might say or they might give if you ask them about this issue. So, I challenge you now to categorize these into those that would be supportive of euthanasia, those that would be opposed to euthanasia. You might like to get two different coloured highlighters if you've printed this slide off, and then you can actually colour coordinate them in terms of which might be completely against euthanasia, which might be supportive of it under certain circumstances. So let's have a look then, shall we? The first one, which is red, which means it is against euthanasia, says, I am against euthanasia because it is always wrong to take life. I believe in the sanctity of life. Euthanasia goes against one of the 10 commandments, do not kill. Therefore, it is always wrong. Another quote then, I am against euthanasia because it goes against Catholic teaching. St. John Paul II said that euthanasia is a grave violation of the law of God. And then the third opposing quote, I am against euthanasia because only God can take away life. We should not be playing God by ending people's lives. We should focus on making them comfortable with palliative care in a hospice until God decides that it is their time to die. So that is a key Catholic view there, that actually the focus should be on palliative care, which is end of life care. So that's about alleviating pain and making somebody comfortable. But you should not be actively ending their life. So palliative care is end of life care, typically provided in a hospice. And that is what the Catholic Church would be advocating. In terms of why some Christians might sometimes believe euthanasia is okay, you could say euthanasia could sometimes be the right thing to do in certain situations. St. Paul said to clothe yourselves with compassion. If someone has a degenerative illness that means they can no longer complete basic tasks for themselves, it would be compassionate to allow them a painless death on their own terms. Or a Christian might say, I think euthanasia might sometimes be the most loving thing to do in certain situations. Joseph Fletcher, who developed situation ethics, said that love's decisions are made situationally. Euthanasia may sometimes be the most loving thing to do. For example, if someone has a terminal illness and their condition is worsening and they want a peaceful death on their own terms rather than prolonged pain. St. Paul said, above all, be loving. This shows that we should do the most loving thing in each situation. So in terms of the key bullet points we need to know, I would say that if you're talking about opposition to euthanasia, so you're giving an argument against it, make sure you refer to the Catholic Church. Whereas if you are giving an opinion that might be supportive of euthanasia, make sure you refer to situation ethics. And that, again, will help you secure the top marks when you are being specific about which denomination or which ethical theory might support that side of the argument. So the Catholic Church believe euthanasia is wrong because it is seen as murder, which means it goes against the 10 Commandments, do not kill. And again, the 10 Commandments do not make exceptions. They do not say do not kill unless someone has a terminal illness or is in increasing pain. They say do not kill, full stop. And that, of course, reflects the fact that Catholics believe in the sanctity of life. Life is holy and it belongs to God. Only God can take away life. Therefore, Pope John Paul II taught that euthanasia is a grave violation against the law of God, because, as I say, only God can give or take away life. And so the Catholic Church advocates for palliative care provided by a hospice as an alternative to euthanasia. So they would say we need to prioritise making sure our end-of-life care is as good as it possibly can, that your suffering is alleviated as much as it possibly can, and you are looked after in your final days until God decides it is time for you to die. But we cannot have a culture where we say, OK, let's allow them to have euthanasia, because the Catholic Church says that would have a very negative effect on society. As Peter Saunders put it, the right to die could become a duty to die. So they would advocate palliative care, caring for people, making sure they're comfortable, rather than actively bringing about the end of their life. So that's how you end the suffering, not by ending their life, but with painkillers, for example, you know, by looking after them in a hospice. In terms of situation ethics, then, as our contrasting view, you might say euthanasia may sometimes be the most loving thing to do. It should, of course, be judged on a case-by-case basis. So with situation ethics, you don't say that something is always right or always wrong. You say it all depends on the situation. Joseph Fletcher, of course, developed it. He said love's decisions are made situationally. So a Christian should always prioritize love, because Jesus said that loving your neighbor is the most important thing you should ever do. And so you have to think in that situation, what is the most loving thing? So we could give the example of Tony Nicklinson, whose condition was worsening and who said, my life has become a living nightmare. You could say that because it was his wish to have a painless and dignified death on his own terms, that should be granted in that situation, because that would be the most loving thing to do. And as St. Paul wrote, above all, be loving. So it would be cruel, it would be unkind to not grant his wish. So a Christian who follows situation ethics might say, in that situation, it would be the most loving thing to do. And then another key argument you could make is an argument based on compassion. So you could say that Christians believe it is important to show compassion to those who are suffering. For example, someone with a terminal illness that is causing them increasing pain. St. Paul also wrote to clothe yourselves with compassion. Now, as I say, he wasn't writing specifically about euthanasia, but that tells us one of the key values in Christianity. And so Christians should use their conscience, use their reason to make a judgment in that situation and think, what is the most loving thing? What is the most compassionate thing to do? Okay, so let's now look at the Islamic views on euthanasia. And I'm not going to ask you to categorize these Islamic beliefs here, because they are all against euthanasia. And that reflects the fact that all Muslims are against euthanasia, and we're now going to find out why. So euthanasia is always wrong, because it is always wrong to take away life. Only God can take away life. The Quran teaches, do not kill yourself or others. As the Quran is the infallible word of God, this command must be followed. The Quran teaches us that God will not burden a soul with more than it can bear. Life is always worth living, and euthanasia should never be used or allowed. Euthanasia is wrong because only God can decide when we die. Nobody may die except by permission of God at an appointed time. And finally, all life is holy and belongs to God. The Quran teaches us that God gave you life. Human life is a gift to be treasured, and so it should never be taken away. So Muslims, as I say, do believe that euthanasia is wrong. So if you are referring to Islam in an answer about euthanasia, make sure you're very clear that there is clear opposition. First point then, euthanasia is always wrong because only God can take away life. It is not our decision to make. Euthanasia would be considered murder. A key quote you could use from the Quran is that nobody may die except by permission of God at an appointed time. The Quran is seen as the infallible word of God, so this command must be taken seriously. And you could also write, euthanasia is always wrong because of the sanctity of life. All life is sacred and holy. The Quran teaches that God gave you life. It is intrinsically valuable and ultimately belongs to God. This means that life must never be taken away, which is why the Quran instructs, do not take your life or others. So they are our key religious views. I want to return again to that key quote from Peter Saunders and the idea that situation ethics would even be wrong, because even if you just say in certain situations we should allow it, he would argue that that is a slippery slope to a really big social problem, because the right to die in exceptional circumstances, he argues, could so easily become a duty to die. And so, you know, that's a nice, again, A-level standard of evaluation that you can start considering. Do you think he's right that even if we said in exceptional circumstances it should be allowed, that would have a negative effect on society? So just something to start thinking about. And also something to also start thinking about is applying this to the exam. So here is a 4-mark question which says, explain 2 similar religious views about euthanasia. And remember, when the command word says similar, that means they need to be the same. So you need to give 2 arguments for the same side of the argument. And remember, explain means go into detail by giving a reason. Use phrases such as this is because or for example. So here's a little structure you could use. You could say Catholic Christians believe that euthanasia is always wrong. This is because, and then obviously give me your explanation, give me your detailed reason why they oppose it. And then obviously, similarly, Muslims believe that euthanasia is always wrong. This is because, and again, give me your reason, give me your developed explanation. And following that structure will secure you 4 out of 4. So have a go at that. Maybe write your answer in the comments below. It would be great to have a read. And I wish you the very best of luck with all of your studies. Have a great day, and I'll see you soon.